Hello, hello, my dispatchers, my listeners. I'm your author, your narrator, your host, Scipio Eruditus. Good to be back with you and glad to be joined once again by Michael A. Hoffman II, just a prolific occult historian and researcher, someone whose work I highly respect on this subject. And of course, he is the author of numerous books: Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, Usury and Christendom, Twilight Language, The Occult Renaissance, Search of Rome. And as we're going to be discussing today, Hitler, Enemy of the German People. And Michael Hoffman, where can people find your work? And thank you once again for joining.
Thank you for that fine introduction, Scipio. This is the book that we'll be discussing the contents of today, and it can be purchased at Amazon.com or at my website, revisionisthistory.org.
Yep, and you write at Substack as well, like myself, so people can find your work there. I mean, if you're watching this on Substack, you should be able to click on his name and there'll be the little byline there. But yeah, I was really looking forward to having you on to discuss this subject because what I've often found in revisionist circles and particularly anti-Zionist circles is you have a tendency amongst people within these kinds of intellectual realms to and I can't blame them on certain fronts, right? We've been lied to about so many things, and certainly, as we're going to discuss today, there have been many lies about World War II. There are legitimate grievances that the Germans have, and the conduct of the Allies towards them after the war and during the war as well is absolutely horrific. So you're certainly not going to get me, and I'm sure Mr. Hoffman as well, making any excuses for the Allied conduct towards the Germans. But just because one thing is true does not mean the opposite is true necessarily. And just because you've been lied about something does not mean that the opposite of that, again, is an outright lie. And so when it comes to the issue of Hitler and the subject of Hitler, there's been a renewed interest and attempt to revive the image of Hitler amongst certain segments of the right wing. There's a look at this movement that is Nazism or National Socialism as a populist movement, as this is something that can, deal with the Zionist influence that is within America. I am quite skeptical of that personally, and I know you are as well. So, yeah, where to even begin with a subject like this, right? Please, elucidate the audience, right, on who Hitler truly was.
Well, I'll give you a summation here at the beginning. Adolf Hitler did more to advance the founding of the Israeli state than any historical figure of the 20th century. So that has to be factored in. And what I want to talk about today is, and many other facets as you wish to explore, is Hitler's unconscionable mass murder of Judaic people, as well as Polish Catholics and the Slavic people of Eastern Europe and Russia, which created the groundwork and the sympathy for the Zionist dispossession of the indigenous people of Palestine. I want to point out something, that Hitler was a traitor to the cause of financial reform. He gained popularity by campaigning in the 1920s and early 30s against usury banks. And this is really still in people's minds today who are leaning towards being sympathetic towards Hitlerism. What they forget is that when he came to power in 1933, he only banned Judaic usurers and fully empowered so-called Aryan usury banks. He had anti-usury German campaigners like Gregor Strasser murdered, and Gottfried Feder, who had been actually the originator of the campaign against Mammon, as he called it, internally exiled. I also want to point out that Hitler was initiated into the occult in the Thule Society, that's spelled Thule, Thule Society, circa 1920. He was imbued with Theosophy's doctrine of root races, Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy Society. Thus began his implacable animus toward the Slavic people. So anti-communist Hitler turned nearly half of Catholic Poland over to the atheist ghouls of Stalin's Soviet Union. And his plans for the half he conquered was to be a Pol Pot type of non-industrial agrarian backwater where Poles of all classes were to be reduced to peonage. In conquering Poland, Hitler did so with indiscriminate firebombing, savagery, unleashed on Warsaw, the capital, in 1939, such as the Allies would turn on Dresden in 1945. And uh, Ron Unz is a revisionist scholar. Daryl Cooper is a revisionist scholar who made a lot of hay on the Tucker Carlson show, as well as the famous David Irving. And all of them, as far as I understand it, I certainly in Unz's case, and in the case of David Irving, would be opposed to just this profile that I gave you here. I do want to point out that I admire David Irving for his courage and for his outstanding debunking of the Winston Churchill myth. Churchill was certainly a war criminal along with Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin. And this is often forgotten, as you pointed out at the start of your introduction, when people are only lionizing these figures, FDR and Churchill and so forth, and then making Hitler out to be the only villain really in the course of the World War II historiography. Um, Here's what Un said, Scipio. He said, more than a dozen years ago, a fully mainstream former German major general named Gerd Schultz Ronhoff published 1939, The War That Had Many Followers. I'm sorry, The War That Had Many Fathers. It was a revelatory 700-page volume on the circumstances leading to the European conflict. The author had been very surprised to discover that Hitler's public speeches had regularly emphasized his desire for peace with the West, along with his proposals for mutual arms control agreements and other confidence-building measures. During the 1939 crisis that led ultimately to the outbreak of World War II, the German leader had actually offered neighboring Poland numerous concessions that none of his democratic Weimar predecessors had ever been willing to consider. But the irresponsible military dictatorship running Poland had refused any negotiations and instead escalated to violent provocations against the sizable German ethnic minority in Poland, ultimately leading to the declaration of war. End quote from Ron Unz. And by the way, he runs a website, unz.com. Okay,
Yeah, the owns review.
yeah.
A lot of
So Mr.
interesting. I mean, yeah, interesting writing there. Definitely don't agree with everything I see, but will tickle your brain nonetheless.
Well, what Mr. Unz is doing here is, and I hope that it's out of ignorance and nothing worse than that, is he's basically restating the Nazi propaganda claims about the start of World War II on September 1st, 1939. And this is just boilerplate for those who are predisposed to believe that there was something benevolent about Hitler at this time period. And as I hope to show in the course of our discussion, this is absolute nonsense, what Unz has stated here. And to a certain extent, I could also indict Daryl Cooper and David Irving, but I'm not going to pin Unz's statement on them in their entirety. Each one of those individual scholars has their own take on the benevolence of Hitler and the malice of Winston Churchill. So we have to be very careful here rather than grouping all three together. But Unz's statement is sort of like the basic explanation for how they are introducing people to this notion that, gee, Hitler was a peacemaker. I mean, this is like a fantastic joke, as I hope to show in the course of our discussion today.
Yeah, and when we look at World War II, and particularly in the West, right, we've been sold this myth that it was good versus evil, and we were just trying to stop these awful, genociders. And yet you look at, the Russians who had conducted a genocide that is, I mean, pales in comparison. If you take the most extreme figures and ascribe every death of World War II to Germany, I mean, with the Holodomor and some of the other, mass starvation campaigns of the Soviets. I mean, while FDR is renewing political relations with the Soviets, they're in the midst of starving, tens of millions of Ukrainian Christians to death. So the idea that it's, oh, well, we just had to stop, we just had to stop the bloodshed. America has allied with and in many ways, is facilitating right now a genocide in Palestine. So the idea that it's, good versus evil here, it again, is just that a fantastical myth. You have really a lot of very shady characters in the West, and as some books have gone over. I know Anthony Sutton's got some great work on this subject, but really analyzing and Carol Quigley and Tragedy and Hope goes over this as well. Is that the West in many ways helped build Hitler up, right? The idea that the West was opposed to Hitler or was opposed to Hitlerism or Nazism. I mean, eventually, obviously, right? But early on, and even well into the late 30s, there was still a lot of support in the West here.
Yes, and on parts of the British aristocracy, the Kennedy family, the young John F. Kennedy, future president of the United States, was feeling very favorable toward them. The problem here is that they're forgetting that. Take a look at Hitler's actions in 1934, the Night of the Long Knives, the so-called Hummingbird Night. Again, the neo-Nazis present this as being a case of traitors who were trying to overthrow Hitler, and that may have been true in the case of Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA,
Hmm.
the stormtroopers. But you're mixing in more than 100 people who were murdered by Hitler without a show trial. Even Stalin gave show trials to the people before he killed them. Hitler saw himself as a all-knowing messiah figure, and that he would, as he said in the course of explaining what he had done, that all of Germany's all responsibility for the German people was on his shoulders alone. And that's always a disaster. As you and I coming from Christianity, we know there's no king but Jesus. We're not going to have Hitler as king or emperor or and so right there he was departing from the traditional German attitude towards things like this authority and so forth. And so what they forget is Kennedy, the aristocrats in Britain and others, is they just took Hitler's statement at face value that these people were trying to rise up against him and they had to be killed. Well, several of those people were completely innocent. When I was talking with David Irving one day in Los Angeles, and he said that there were many, and I think it's also in his book, The Warpath, which is the first volume of his two-volume Hitler's War, and is an outstanding history on the merits of his military knowledge of the war. But anyway, he told me that he conceded that there were many innocent people who were killed in the Night of the Long Knives. Now, he and I did not discuss the case of Gregor Strasser, who was not to be confused with his brother Otto Strasser, who was a kind of a quasi communist in some ways, one could say, at least Marxist. Gregor was nothing like that. Gregor was a Roman Catholic pharmacist who was a hero of the First World War, and who became one of the top organizers for the NSDAP, the German Workers' National Socialist Party in northern Germany, which is surprising because northern Germany is largely Protestant, Prussia. And here is Strasser, a Catholic. And yet he did tremendous organizing there in the 1920s, which benefited the party tremendously. And in fact, many people saw him as the possible leader of the future party. I think had that happened, you would have never seen the attack on the Soviet Union, the suicidal attack in June of 1941. Strasser had a very different attitude toward race and other aspects. But one of his key issues, along with Feder, who I mentioned earlier, Feder, was the idea that renting of money was a disaster for the working class. And this has been a traditional Western European Christian attitude all the way up until May of 1515, when the Medici Pope Leo X created a loophole and began the incremental, it was slow, the incremental permission for usury in the Western world. That is usually blamed on Calvin. Calvin was a little boy when this happened. Calvin went along with a 5% interest rate. At the same time, he hated usurers, and bankers and usurers weren't even allowed into Calvin's citadel in Geneva, Switzerland. But be that as it may, Strasser was the main campaigner, and I will submit that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, Nazi Party, really won the vote in January of 1933 because of their stand against usury. Certainly, there were other factors like the repudiating the Versailles Treaty. There's many others, but that was a major plank of their popularity. And I challenge anyone on that issue. And here, Hitler then, once he gets into power, completely turns against that, betrays it, closes down and drives away the Judaic usurers, and enhances the usury and the power of non-Judaic banks in Germany, and at the same time has Strasser murdered. This is just absolutely outrageous, and people did not factor that in when they were coming from the West. They were looking at You know, Hitler developed the Autobahn. You know, he invented the Volkswagen, the car of the people. He had industry on a great footing. He was going to repudiate the Versailles Treaty. All of this was looked on with favor. What they forget is that economic miracle that Hitler created was largely based on the fact that he knew he was going to war. The idea that he's a peacemaker, this guy from the 1920s had talked about the hygienic effects of war on a population, that it was good that every generation would go through war. He was a social Darwinist. The peace is rhetorical in order to, uh, soothe his enemies into believing that this was the case. So, anyway, we have a trail here of revisionist history, which I think ought to be really factored in when people are talking about Hitler. And so much of revisionist history, as we know about revisionist history of the Holocaust and other aspects like that, has been policed out of the chronicle. And this is what's happened with revisionists themselves. I mean, I've been a revisionist since the 1970s, but I've been policed out of the revisionist movement, which should be by its nature anti-dogmatic. And and so what we have is the mandate, with some exceptions, has been an unwritten maxim among revisionists, and that is that the rehabilitation of the reputation of Adolf Hitler is the sine qua non of Second World War revisionism. And this is a radical departure from the bedrock revisionist mission. To varying degrees, a majority of what passes for World War II revisionism today is ideologically tilted toward defending, to one degree or another, Hitler's record. And revisionists who are not on board, like me, are ostracized and boycotted. So, what I would say, Scipio, is that, like its enemies, much of World War II revisionism in its tattered 21st century remnant privileges conformity over free inquiry and debate and suppresses dissenting viewpoints. That's been the fate of my book, Adolf Hitler, Enemy of the German People. It's apparently too explosive for my fellow revisionists to review, even critically. It's been accorded the silent treatment by the revisionist movement itself, and they have been the ones who have cried loudest about their own books and treatises being accorded that type of treatment. So, for me, it's a badge of honor to be loathed by communists, Zionists, Talmudists, adorers of Churchill, defenders of Hitler. It's a badge of honor. I stand for open-minded inquiry, and I think that should be the gold standard of authentic revisionism, which is dogma's most formidable enemy and is a very worthy pursuit for anyone, but not in the sense that it's aimed at a dogmatic rehabilitation of Hitler's reputation. Absolutely not, as I hope to show as we proceed.
Yeah, no, you made several important points there. I think, have you read The Vampire Economy by Gunther Reimann?
No.
He makes a very similar case to you. Now, I know a lot of the pro-Hitler people say, well, he was a socialist and he had an axe to grind. And admittedly, from a historical perspective, he cites a lot of like anonymous sources. But there's been some more recent work on this subject and really analyzing the German economy and this myth of, the German economy as this titan. Uh, Much of their progress was entirely dependent. I mean, as we see in America as well, helping to get us out of FDR's largely induced economic malaise. But a lot of that was driven by war, by the manufacturing and the building up of the German military. I mean, you had something like 20% of the GDP for the 1930s. For all of 1930s, right, for Germany, 20% of their GDP. Something like that, right, was dedicated to military spending. I mean, just an enormous, enormous sum for any nation. And so much of this was driven on the fact, right, on the predication that yes, there was going to be an expanding of the German, empire, right, the Fourth Reich, that there would be, the expansion of so much territory. This was very much built in, and from a more critical perspective, what's it? Adam Tooze, the wages of destruction. He covers this as well, right? For some who would quibble with the vampire economy, although I would still recommend the book. For those who would quibble with it, you have even people much removed from the situation, right, with no axe to grind, uh, have analyzed a lot of this economic data and come to some of these similar conclusions. The other thing I would say too is that when we look back at the rise of Hitler and what precipitated so much of this, you many of the promises, the campaign promises of Hitler and that he ran on, right? What we saw is much of those were reneged upon. You mentioned usury earlier. One of the big aspects of his initial campaign run was this use and this adoption of Christian language, and you see it even now. Some people try and claim, right, that oh no, Hitler was actually a Christian.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know how anyone could say something like that. I mean, they clearly have never read Mein Kampf. In Mein Kampf, he's very clear that I mean, he talks about Christ, but he talks about him like in a basically like Marcion talked like Christ, right? He totally rejects the Old Testament. He rejects any kind of Hebrew influence upon Christianity, and so for him, Christ was, in many ways like a, Buddha figure, a philosophical benchmark that we should, try and aim towards. But the idea that he was in any way authentic Christian and it's just quite a stretch, right? And what you'll find is, despite his rhetoric publicly professing a lot of these things, privately he was quite skeptical. And I mean, again, Mein Kampf makes this very clear.
Oh, he was hostile. I mean, and you're right about talking about this notion of the Aryan Christ, because they had the German national church that the Nazis tried to create was disconnected from the Old Testament. Here, Jesus quotes the Old Testament. Jesus and the apostles quote the Old Testament favorably hundreds of times, and yet he's going to create this Jesus figure who repudiates the Old Testament. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I don't think the German people actually bought it. On the other hand, he was clever enough to know that the German army, the Wehrmacht, had still a tremendous attachment to the Lutheran and Catholic churches. So chaplains of those different denominations accompanied the armies across Europe, because he didn't want them to depart from Nazism if they saw that it was anti-God or anti-Christ. It's the same rationale that Stalin provided when he reactivated the Russian Orthodox Church and put the high priests of the church up on a podium to bless the troops as they went off to war. Utterly cynical. And anyone who understands Hitler understands that he was out to create a new religion, and that was National Socialism, and would not brook any other competitors. So that he said, even though there's a far out Protestant notion that Hitler was a Jesuit agent and he was pro-Catholic, and this is laughable. But at the same time, he himself was very anti-Catholic. Poland and Ireland were the two most Catholic nations in all of Europe. And look what he did. And I hope to show what he did to Poland, Catholic Poland. He turned his half of Poland, he had an agreement with Stalin to divide it. He turned the other half of Poland over to Stalin and his atheist ghouls. Now, what was going to be the fate of all those millions of Catholic under Stalin? So, I mean, the idea is really crazy. And also, this notion of he wanted a Nietzschean type of faith that would emerge. It would be the Superman. It would be might is right. There was no use for cripple. Look, he gassed. There's no question that he gassed the retarded. He gassed the mentally ill prior to the Second World War, and because they were considered to be useless eaters. This is of Christ. Christianity is based on Jesus said, if you're a wealthy man, then it's impossible for you to get into heaven. And then later he said, with God, all things are possible. But it was really a faith that was predicated on being kind and decent and loving toward the poor and the least of my brethren. So I don't see how they can stand. I'd be happy to debate that with someone. I mentioned some aspects of the Hitler's secular religion, you could call it, and the utter contempt he had for the Vatican. He told his allies that at the end of the war, he would take care of the Pope and the Vatican. And I think that meant that they'd had it, because he assumed that he was going to supremely triumph in his battle plans. And of course, he was remarkably successful in the West against France initially, and of course against Poland. And then later on, it was an entirely different story with the invasion of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to segue into, the a very prominent role that occultism and esotericism played amongst the Nazi leadership. Perhaps you could go a little bit more into that, particularly as it relates to this idea of, Nazism or Hitler himself in some way being a representative of, Christian civilization.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't see how a representative Christian civilization can make an alliance with the mass murderer, as you already pointed out, of Christians by the name of Joseph Stalin. I don't get that at all. And from 1939 to September, I'm sorry, from 1939 to September of 1941, Hitler and Stalin were pals. And Stalin was shipping a tremendous amount of the material that the Nazis needed, oil and raw materials for building and construction, everything that was supposed to come about as a result of keeping that pledge to be allied to each other. But Hitler had an occult animus toward the Slavic people. And so he wasn't going to, of course, Stalin, he did have a sneaking admiration for Stalin, who, as you know, was not a Slav. He was a Georgian. His real name wasn't Stalin. And but no, what we have here is when I was researching Adolf Hitler, Enemy of the German People, some revisionists asked, why are you writing another anti-Hitler book? There are hundreds. And that's correct. But I strive to write when no one has written before. And here's the sticking point. No one, at least to my satisfaction, had studied the betrayals committed by Hitler of the German mass movement that Strasser and Feder got going, and also the fact that he was a Thule Society initiate. It was from occult doctrine that Hitler gained conviction that the Slavic race consisted of Untermenschen, in other words, subhumans. In Mein Kampf, he wrote, I'm not going to give you the German, I'll give you the English translation. I had the German there. The organization of a Russian state was not the result of political achievement of the Slavs in Russia, but rather a wonderful example of the state-forming efficacy of the Germanic element inside an inferior race. That's from Mein Kampf, Volume 2, Chapter 14. So he's trying to say that a small minority of Germans inside the mass of this population of Slavs were responsible for the creation of the Russian state. And from the Thule magus named Dietrich Eckart, Hitler imbibed theosophy, and Eckart provided Hitler with an intellectual grounding in philosophy, specifically its concept of root races. Now, this was synthesized by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century. Theosophy proposed a mystical framework of human evolution divided into 7 races, each associated with different stages of spiritual and physical development. The 5th root race, the Aryan, was considered by theosophists to be the pinnacle of current human evolution. Hitler's mentor, Dietrich Eckart, a key figure in the Thule Society, was steeped in these and other racist, esoteric ideas which held that elements of other Caucasian racial subsets were inferior, chief among them the Slavs. And Hitler's conduct of his war in Poland and the impressions he gathered on his trips to the Polish front strengthened his racist denigration of the devoutly Catholic Slavic Poles. I quote from Alfred Rosenberg, who accompanied Hitler, the cities were caked in filth. If Poland had ruled for another couple of decades over the old parts of the Reich, everything would have been infested and dilapidated. Only an unerring, masterly hand can rule Poland. And that's found in the book Alfred Rosenberg, Die Tagebücher von 1934 bis 1944. So Hitler expressed even more intense contempt in conversations with Goebbels in early October, including and we get this from Goebbels' diary, quote, the Fuhrer's verdict on the Poles is devastating, the propaganda minister wrote. He said they were, quote, more animal than human, completely coarse and undistinguished. Then on a meeting of October 17th, 1939 in the Chancellery, which was attended by Himmler, Rudolf Hess, Bormann, Hans Lammers, Hans Frank, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Reich Minister of the Interior Frick State Secretary Stuckart, Hitler lays out the methods by which his administrators in Poland were to operate. A bitter ethnic struggle would have to be waged, Hitler said, that would know no legal bounds. This is the supposed Christian, anti-occult Hitler, because people have not explored these areas. That's the job of the revisionist, to go in and shine a light where no one else has, because we're all human and we all tend to be predisposed towards that which favors our own particular doctrines and beliefs. And so the revisionist argues against that, including against his own beliefs, and goes in here and says, wait a minute, I do believe that Hitler had some sympathy for Christianity and thought it had done some good. But let's look into this. Is it possible that he was really violently anti-Christian and took such a low opinion of the Slavs and Polish people? And was so absolutely indifferent to the fate of Polish Catholics under the communist ghouls, the atheists. And so that's where I proceeded against my own prejudgment. Most people don't do that. I don't mean to toot my own horn. I certainly have a lot of flaws and foibles like anybody else. But in this particular case, I'm really driven not only by a desire for the truth, but by curiosity. When I find something like this that hasn't been discovered by others, or if they discovered it, they suppressed it, it gets me excited. I'm really enthusiastic. I have a kid's sense of curiosity about these things, and between my desire to learn the truth so that people will be educated about these matters and not fall into this revival of neo-Nazism, National Socialism, and at the same time just curious about, wow, this runs counter to everything I've been taught about Hitler on both sides, really, because even the Allied propagandists against the German people do not bring this up. So it was of interest to me, and I think it's important that people delve more into Hitler's occultism. For example, his view of the Tatars. He claimed that most of Russia was Tatar. In other words, again, a race almost equivalent to his view of Judaic people as being sinister and incapable of a great civilization, and that's how he saw the Russians, and that's really why part of the reason why I think they had such tremendous contempt for the Russian people as they invaded. Even though I know that Russian people who were still harboring their Christian vestiges did greet initially the Wehrmacht with bread and salt, as it said, welcomed them into their towns because they had bristled under Soviet control, these rural areas and so forth. But eventually, as the German military position deteriorated, the Germans were throwing these villagers out of their own homes into the Russian winter and taking their food. And somebody could say, well, this was a necessity on the part of the German troops because they'd almost been abandoned by Hitler's magical thinking. I knew one of the German generals. He was actually a colonel at the time. He was sent back by his other officers to Berlin to tell Hitler they had no supplies, no ammunition, no clothes, no warm clothing, very little food. And Hitler just hypnotized. This was Otto Ernst Rehmer. Hitler basically just hypnotized Rehmer not to bring it up, and he told him, "Use your willpower to overcome this." That magical thinking that he gained from his occult apprenticeship. And this is what really destroyed the millions of troops. I mean, the biggest killer of Germans was Hitler. He sent millions of troops into Russia. They never came back. They died or they went into the Siberian camps. So the revisionists don't factor this in. And of course, since they won't debate me and they won't review my book, it's only through free thinkers like yourself that I have an opportunity to present this information.
Oh, certainly. One of the things I've always found rather quite odd is, at least from an American perspective, I understand why a German nationalist might want to rehabilitate Hitler, why that would be something, not that I agree, right? But that I can understand why they would seek to do that. What I will never understand is why an American, you would use your political or social capital in that manner, right? To rehabilitate someone who's not even of your like lineage. If you want to rehabilitate some, figures throughout American history, I mean, why not Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson? I mean, actual Christian men, right? And that are Americans that we can look back, certainly look back towards their example. Those would be figures that I would point people towards, right? To read their writings and to look at how they handled the tyrannical northern regime. But it's always been very curious to me, this push, and particularly among revisionist and anti-Zionist circles, right, to rehabilitate Hitlerism. I really just don't understand it. Certainly from a a secular perspective, perhaps, right, but from a Christian perspective or anyone professing that banner, quite puzzling.
Yes, indeed. And I also think that I'm trying to rehabilitate is the German people themselves, who are collectively reviled, and the claim that they were all fanatical Nazis and Hitler was overwhelmingly popular. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, never won a majority in any election, any national election in which it participated, including the final one that led to Hitler's dictatorship, where he declared all the other political parties outlawed and obsolete. And this is not known. In the election 1933, the NSDAP won less than 40% of the vote. But because there were a number of other parties uh, competing, and that one party won 15%, another party won 20%, and it makes it look as though the Nazi Party had this tremendous support from the German people. It did not. On the eve of the invasion of Poland, I have the details in my book, and I can bring them up for your audience. The German people were silent. They were apprehensive about the forthcoming attack on Poland. They had heard rumors, and when it was announced, it was the same type of reaction. Also, you have to understand that these newsreel photos of the Sieg Heiling children and adults and everything else, these newsreels don't back up about 500 yards or 400 yards and see that there were thousands of other Germans who were just standing there with their arms folded. They didn't know what to make of Hitler. And his dictatorship, when they say that the German people are collectively responsible, Daniel Jonah Goldhagen says that in his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. FDR said that the entire German people were in a conspiracy against civilization. And of course, the corollary of that being then the U.S. Army Air Force is going to go over and set the major German cities on fire in conjunction with the Royal Air Force of Great Britain. This is a terrible, terrible lie against the German people, putting the mark of Cain on them. They were under a ruthless dictatorship. How could they revolt against it once it got going? Once Hitler really got nailed down and had the secret police working, you would have to go along with it, or you would be shot, or you would be imprisoned. And there was a very lively anti-Hitler movement in Germany in the underground, which is more and more, it's getting more publicity now. But my point is that the rehabilitation of the German people depends on understanding how wicked and how dictatorial Adolf Hitler was, because this is a guy that all of Germany, and this is something people have to understand, once Hitler was in power, everyone in Germany was Hitler's slave. It's at this juncture where this plain fact, which many of Hitler's admirers flee, must be faced. Everyone in Germany was a slave. With his ascent to power in 1933, the rule of law in the ancient Teutonic nation, the cradle of art, music, literature, philosophy, science, and technology, had been crushed in what was a revival of primitive, absolute rule by one man. Now, how can any American who admires George Washington and Thomas Jefferson go along with such a thing? This was anathema to the American founders. I mean, of course, they predated Hitler, but the whole notion of a one rule by one man is absolutely anathema to the idea of the American Republic. So, where are these people going with these anti-American where are the Americans going when they show some favoritism towards Hitler? Are you an American or are you not? Under Hitler, Führer was another word for emperor. And in the Hitlerian version of National Socialism, Adolf was magnitudes above even despotism. He was, in his own estimation, a messianic figure possessed of infallibility, invincibility, and omniscience. And I can prove that. Investing those godlike attributes in any mere man, however great or good, and Hitler was neither, constitutes idolatry, which history teaches is always a recipe for disaster. And you don't have to be a Christian to believe that. And I think this is overlooked as well. Do you really want to have so much sympathy for Hitler that you're going to create another one in America? Watch out when you dissent and you're headed to an American concentration camp under an American Hitler. And I don't see this much discussed either. And or if it is, they actually claim that Hitler was a Democrat. I don't know. This type of ignorance really becomes overwhelming after a while.
Yeah, it is quite dizzying, that's for certain. And where's I gonna go here? Yeah, the subject of the occult, certainly one that's gotten, more press in recent years, and there's been a great deal of scholarly work and literature on the subject. I mean, that is fairly unimpeachable at this point that Hitler and very many of the Nazi high leadership were esotericists, they were occultists, and of course, there were plenty on the Allied side who were also occultists as well. It's something I talked about in my Frankenstein formula series, how the British RAF were consulting wizards and mystics and astrologers to try and find out what was the most opportune or most auspicious time to conduct aerial raids and attacks and things of this sort. So certainly, right, when we look at the Allies and we look at the evils of Hitler, there are honestly they're conducted and they're engaged in a lot of very similar behavior, frankly. And you look at 1939 and Hitler taking Poland. I'm very much of the opinion that he thought that nothing really was going to happen, like so many other times. And there had been, signals given to him by the British aristocracy that, and he had had plenty of signals before that too, quite overt and covert, that hey, if you go and take this land, if you go and take this and expand, the German territory, no one's going to stop you. Nothing's going to happen, right? And as he had seen throughout the 1930s, he had actually been supported financially by numerous entities here in the West. What was the other thing I was going to mention? The When we look at really the economic policies too of National Socialism, it is again, it is National Socialism, right? I mean, the economy has been bent towards the will of the state. And what you found is from the earliest days of the Nazi Party, is that they had high-ranking and very wealthy backers, including some of the wealthiest German industrialists in the country. And I forget the name. I forget the name of the. Oh man, yeah, I forget the name of the gentleman. But Hitler received a letter after his election from one of these gentlemen, one of these industrialists, saying pretty much this, right? That everything we have wanted has come to pass. Well, why would he say that? Well, because what has unfolded is the mobilization of the German economy and the consolidation of power in the hands of very few men. Carol Quigley talks about this in Tragedy and Hope as well, right? That it is, from the capitalist perspective, the idea that free markets or that's like natural, or that is how capitalism, quote unquote, should be. I mean, if you are a wealthy industrialist, a wealthy capitalist, I mean, you really don't want competition, right? I mean, that's bad for business. Frankly, it is from a capitalist perspective. There's really not that much difference between what we've seen play out in America, the consolidation of various American industries in the hands of the powerful, in the hands of the few, and what we saw play out in Germany.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Scipio, because that's really one of the motivations for Hitler's commencing the Second World War and the attack on Poland. His focus on the economic necessity of going to war, and here's a direct quote from him. He said, "We have nothing to lose and everything to gain because of the restrictions our economic situation imposes on us. We can only hold out for a few more years. We have no choice. We must act." Hitler was alluding to his enormous military expenditures, which had brought Germany to the verge of insolvency, as the former president of the Reichsbank, Helmer Schacht, who had been fired in January 1939, predicted. It was already transparent that Hitler intended that the war would transfer the costs of the financial crisis to the people Nazi Germany was going to conquer. And so this makes it inevitable that he was going to go into Poland. And one other thing you brought up that I want to address is also the talk about esotericism and the occult in Great Britain, which of course stretches all the way back to the regime of Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century, and her dealings with Dr. John Dee, the necromancer, and many other aspects of the occult, which I've also discussed in my other books. But I think what we have to understand is the aficionados of Hitler will always say, how can he be an occultist when he closed the Masonic lodges in Germany? And they make other statements along those lines. Well, this is an idea that like the occult is a monolith, and there's no competing factions to it. And what the occult really is you could make an analogy with automobiles, the manufacture of cars and vehicles like that. Does Ford do everything it can to undermine General Motors? Of course. And does General Motors do everything it can undermine Ford? Of course. Does that mean that they're anti-car, either one of them, or anti-vehicle? No. So Hitler got rid of his occult competitors inside of the occult regime. and then himself elevated through both the SS, the Waffen SS under Himmler, and other aspects, this occultism that he wanted to create. So the notion that he shut down his competitors, well, Ford would have loved to have done that to General Motors and yet go right on ahead and build even more cars and better trucks. It's the same thing with Hitler. He was going to advance this theosophical orientation toward this racist orientation toward extirpating Slavic people, at the same time closing down the Masonic lodges. So there really is no conflict there, but they missed that particular point.
And this assumes we take that whole scenario at face value. What I've seen plenty of times before, Imperial Japan is a perfect example, is where they will be ostensibly anti-Mason, and yet you will still have high-ranking officials who are members of the Freemasons, right? So it's like when it comes to the public lodges and the like the laymen, right? The low level Masons, yeah, I mean they shut all that stuff down. But when it comes to the high level Masons and these covert lodges, crypto Masonry, which is a very real phenomenon, I am obviously much more skeptical, right? And you look at Hitler, you know, as much of the mythology, and I think much of the revival is this idea, right? Well, we look at the West, and we look at how, and particularly for America, right, how so many of our politicians, our governments are beholden to Israel. And there's this idea, well, Hitler was against Israel, right? He was against the Jews. And yet, as you stated at the beginning of this, there's probably no other figure in the 20th century who did more directly to help the founding of Israel. Can you speak a little bit about the Havara Agreement and how significant this was?
It means in terms of supporting the emigration of Judaic people to Palestine.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, that's not my field of specific study, but it certainly is an indicator that there was an element there that wanted to facilitate that emigration. But I would also say that that may have been exaggerated to a certain extent because the Nazis, first and foremost, were sympathetic toward the Palestinians. And I still don't understand entirely how this would come about, the agreement that you're referencing, except that it came at a time when the Nazis were beginning to be desperate about their situation and perhaps were trying to build some goodwill in some faction of their enemies. So I'll leave that to your own area of expertise. But one thing I wanted to say before we closed out the program is I started out at the top of the broadcast talking about how Mr. Unz and David Irving and Daryl, the fellow who was on Tucker Carlson, had talked about
Yeah,
this
Martyr
idea
Maid.
that, pardon me?
Martyr Maid.
Yes. Hitler stated he would guarantee the continued existence of the British Empire, no matter the circumstances, and help the empire wherever such assistance might become necessary. And he promised that he would no longer resist reasonable limits on armaments, and he would recognize that Germany's western borders were fixed and unchangeable. And he emphasized this was his final offer. He told the British ambassador to Germany to return to London without delay and present these proposals. Well, Hitler made this offer to Britain during a meeting with the British ambassador August 25th, 1939, at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, 2 days after signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin. Now, establishment historians denigrate Hitler's seeming generosity as nothing more than a ham-fisted attempt to get Britain to renege on its promises to Poland. Our first reaction is to discount this claim and regard it as the usual subservience to what has become more of a liturgy than a history subject to robust scrutiny. However, even Goebbels, the Führer's sycophant, was doubtful about the chances of success with this latest gambit of his. Quote, England is not going to believe us anymore, he said in his diary of August 26, 1939. Goebbels was referring to Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland with promises of no further territorial demands, and with Germany's occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The Fuhrer broke his promise, shattering trust in his word. Goebbels understood that Britain, burned by Munich and alarmed by the Nazi-Soviet pact, would view Hitler's August 25th offer as another insincere ploy, and this is exactly right. The plain truth is that it was at this juncture where Hitler had decided to go to war, start the Second World War. And this simply is just not understood. He's the one who started the Second World War, and he wanted to take over Poland. Okay, and so when he sent the 16 points to Polish negotiators, for example, this is part separate from what he offered Great Britain. The demands included, among other points, Danzig's return to the German Reich, the establishment of an interim transit corridor, an internationally supervised referendum in the corridor, and the formation of an investigatory committee to assess the treatment of Poland's German minority, who were harshly treated by the Polish government, no question about it. Now, the question is, was Hitler sincere? Those who look favorably on him believe he was, but his overarching might is right philosophy is often overlooked or ignored by his defenders. There was no room for the idea of lasting peace in Hitler's social Darwinist worldview. Peace, Hitler often reiterated privately, would only lead humanity into a quagmire. Every generation, he believed, had to steel itself anew for war. And that was Goebbels' testimony about Hitler. And so you look at the 16 points, and it was delivered just a few days, almost hours before Hitler's invasion. Why was there supposed to be a rush to war? And then they had these false flag attacks, which were on the eve of the invasion. That what happened was SS Special Forces staged a series of border incidents, including an attack on the German radio station in Gleiwitz to give Germany a pretext to attack. At the scene of the fake attack, they deposited the bodies of murdered concentration camp inmates dressed in Polish uniforms. Polish attack on the Gleiwitz station. We will be making this really big, wrote Goebbels, even though he knew the truth behind the attack. In the same diary entry, the propaganda minister noted, the SS has special orders tonight. Okay. So, although the Nazis destroyed parts of these reports, which showed how it was a false flag attack on different German assets by alleged Poles, and that thereby created an alibi for the invasion. An August 1939 memo from Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief, emphasizes the requirement for provocations to legitimize military action. Now, it is undeniable that between May and August 1939, about 10,000 ethnic Germans resident in Poland were arrested by Polish authorities, accused of subversive activities on behalf of the Nazis. And many of them were interned in a concentration camp with poor sanitation and so forth. But their release could have been obtained through diplomatic negotiation, and no such negotiation was undertaken. On August 31st, one day before the start of the Second World War, Hitler stayed until midnight in the Chancellery studying maps of the theater war with his generals. He then dictated the speech he intended to give to the Reichstag on the Kohl Opera House the next morning. When he went to the Opera House venue after having received an energy-boosting injection, methamphetamine, from his morbidly obese physician, Theodor Morell, Hitler was greeted in silence by the entire theater audience. He is very serious and looks worn and pale, observed Rudolf Bultmann, a veteran Nazi Party member from Hitler's time in Munich. And Bultmann describes in his book, Verteidigung des Reichstags, which describes the speech with no mention of applause or cheers upon Hitler's entrance. And internal Nazi correspondence indicated a muted reception. In his oration, the Fuhrer stated, since dawn today, we are shooting back, and from now on, bombs will be met with bombs. Whoever fights with poison gas will be met with poison gas. Whoever departs from the rules of humane warfare can expect we will do the same. Poland has invaded our territory and fired on it. We are now shooting back. The Germans in Poland are being persecuted with a bloody terror and are being driven from their homes. A series of violations will cry out to heaven that they have been committed by the Poles. Okay, end quote from Hitler. There had been no bombings by Poland, no poison gas attacks, no bloody terror in August. Poland did not fire on German territory in August. Hitler's invasion was a premeditated act. The Second World War began at 4:45 a.m. on September 1st after Hitler ordered the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored in Danzig Harbor, to open fire on the Polish garrison on the peninsula. Okay. So in Danzig, as the Germans invaded Poland, stormtrooper and SS units headed out to arrest Polish civil servants, teachers, and priests whose names were on lists that had been prepared in advance. From the air, the Luftwaffe struck military bases as well as cities. The first target to be bombed at dawn on September 1st was the militarily insignificant Polish town of Wielin. Three waves of Stuka dive bombers hit it, including attacking the hospital, and killed an estimated 2,000 civilians. In retaliation, on September 3rd, Polish troops and civilians, believing ethnic Germans were aiding the invaders, began rounding them up as suspected saboteurs. And Polish soldiers and armed civilians killed several hundred ethnic Germans at that time. Some were executed after summary trials. And so, I mean, this is what we're beginning to see. Also, if you look at what they did to Poland, what they did to Warsaw, it's something like what the Allies did to Dresden from September 13th to September 27th, using incendiary ordnance, in other words, fire bombs containing oil-based mixtures and magnesium thermite fillers. This was before napalm. The Nazi Air Force indiscriminately bombed the city of Warsaw, including schools, churches, apartment blocks, synagogues, and hospitals. Luftwaffe records confirmed their use of incendiaries in 1939, including in Warsaw. The heaviest single day of Nazi bombing occurred on September 25th, when the Luftwaffe launched 400 sorties, dropping 5,000 tons of high explosives incendiary bombs across Warsaw. The entire city was targeted, with no discernible distinction made between military and civilian areas. Approximately 10,000 Polish civilians were killed in the bombings and 35,000 wounded, with 30% of Warsaw's buildings destroyed or severely damaged. I mean, this is like what the Israelis did in Gaza. It's like what the Allies did in Dresden, and for that matter, every major city in Germany. Yet the pro-Hitler camp only looks at what happened under the Allies bombing the German cities, and what happened to Poland here is not in their consciousness. So if you have that level of censored history that you're operating from, then many of these absurd statements by some of the people we've already quoted have some type of credibility. But in the face of the documentary record, it does not. And so this is my main point with our discussion today. And I want you to follow up, but I do want to thank you for this opportunity, because it's few and far between. People will invite me on their programs to discuss Twilight language, the revelation of the method, usury, because I wrote the book Usury in Christendom, and other things like that. Very seldom am I asked on by people who are independent of the Zionist agenda, let's say that, asked on to discuss this aspect, this hidden aspect of the villainy of Hitler and his desire for war, and the disaster that it brought upon the German people as much as upon the Jews. That's why I titled my book, Hitler, Enemy of the German People. And I think this needs to be emphasized, and I'm willing to debate it. So I do thank you for this opportunity, Scipio.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time, sir, and your knowledge here. It is much needed, and particularly as some of these narratives begin to pick up steam and momentum. And it's, a great book on the subject of the Havar Agreement, and just, the Nazi relations with Israel in general, right? Because you would imagine, oh, Hitler, hates the Jews. He would never make any kind of political agreements with the Zionists over in Palestine, and yet what we saw is actually a great deal of, intermingling between them, quite curiously. But Zionism in the Age of the Dictators by
Oh yeah,
Lenny Brenner, yeah, a great book on the subject.
yes.
Yeah, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it.
Yes,
Very
Lenny
interesting.
Brenner. Lenny Brenner. I don't know if he's still alive, but that was a very important book. And I wanted to ask you for you mentioned the book Wages of Destruction. Who is that by?
Yes. Adam, I'm looking at the name here. I believe it's Tooze, Tooze,
T
The
O
Wages
O
of
Z E.
Destruction.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
but
then
it's
the
an
vamp
economic analysis of National Socialism.
in the vampire economy, even though you're a little bit reluctant to totally recommend it, say because you say some of the citations are anonymous, but who wrote that one?
Gunther Reimann, Riemann.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I wasn't aware of either book. I'm going to pay most attention to the two's work, but appreciate that information.
Yeah, I would say from a scholarly perspective, his is probably like, safer to cite. I mean, it's, meticulous, but Vampire Economy is still a good one. It's still very, illuminating to the reality of, the situation for those who were not part of the party, who were not part of, the in group, as it were. This was certainly not any kind of civilization you would want to live under if you were not full bar, behind the political agenda of Hitler and of National Socialism. So, the only thing really I would quibble with, with what you just discussed there is that you said that World War II started on 1939. I think the reality is, or in 1939 rather, I think the reality of these and so many other wars is that they started a long time before that actually. And what we
I
saw
guess
in the lead up,
I
yeah,
guess I
no, I
would
was just gonna
modify it. I would modify it to say that the military aspect of the war began on September
certainly, yeah.
1st. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. No, it's, these, particularly in the last several hundred years, with the rise of Masonry and the mystery religion in general, it has, war is really no longer an organic thing. I mean, even you look at what's going on in, Iran right now. The idea is that, oh, this all just happened. It all just broke out. Israel was going to strike. I mean, we were feeding in strike groups and bombers and troops, all precipitating that occurring. So the idea that, oh, we just this just happened, war just break out, people just get assassinated. I mean, these things don't happen, right? These are like fictions that are told to people. The reality is that war is planned for a very long time beforehand, and the conditions for war are created. And so whether it is with Stalin and the Lend-Lease program and essentially America creating the Soviet military that we would then have to fight, quote unquote, in the Cold War. And then similarly for the Nazi regime, I mean, you can thank the Rockefellers, you can thank Standard Oil, and some of their British subsidiaries for essentially, you know, fueling up the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. So it is the idea really that World War II is these, it's good versus evil, it's David versus Goliath, it's the Avengers, versus the bad guys. I mean, this is, these kind of analogies are given to you because they are meant to really stop critical thinking. But when you actually look at the historical record, at least what I've found is that these are not two good guys or two, good versus evil here. I mean, these are two very evil regimes fighting each other, and the narratives and the mythology we would be told about this, it would be just as twisted, if other nations had come out on top.
And as David Irving said, if the British Tommies, another word for the British troops, if the British troops who landed at Normandy on the beaches there could see the state of England in the 21st century, they wouldn't have gone 20 yards up that beach.
Certainly. I mean, and that's same thing for, America, right? You look at what's happened, you look at the aftermath of World War II. It's very hard to argue from an American perspective that we won this thing, right? You look at what has unfolded, the chaos that has unfolded since the rise of, Pax Americana, quote unquote, right? Which an absurd, absurd description of the post World War II era, but it
Well,
is, yeah, man, if this is victory, then I really don't want to see defeat.
yeah, Pyrrhic victory. And also the fact
Yes,
that World War II was allegedly fought initially to keep Poland free, and in 1945, at the conclusion of the war, Poland was utterly enslaved to the Soviet Union, and Churchill and the rest of them were fine with that in terms of the practical matter of even handing over Christian anti-communists back into the claws of Stalin. And then later on, after Churchill was instrumental in that enslavement, he gives his famous speech in Missouri about an iron curtain having descended upon Europe, where you're the one who dropped the curtain down upon them. And to this day, this is overlooked as part of Churchill's treachery. And his image is burnished by certain factions the way Hitler's image is burnished. In fact, the Hillsdale College is basically exists to idolize Churchill. And I have not seen any, yeah, and I've not seen any concerted attempt to give a voice to the other side to debate that. And again, whenever, as you said, whenever critical thinking is suppressed and we don't have this debate, then we know we're headed towards another type of tyranny. And I don't care whether it's the left or the right. I'm in favor of, which is the 250th anniversary of America's birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence. And I'm in favor of that dream that those founders envisaged and actually realized here. And for a long time, we had that American Republic prior to the war between the states, where a certain type of tyranny on the part of Lincoln created a sort of a different government after that. Although I'm not utterly a votary of the Confederacy or the South by any means. Of course, I am a supporter of the people of the Southland. But what I'm saying is that what we can grasp as the American Republic certainly went from 1776 up until the eve of 1861. And also I have to say that in every generation, there are a group of people who try to revive that spark. And I recently did a Substack column on William Jennings Bryan and his struggle for silver and for the right of individual Americans to hold it and mine it. And again, that was, that was a kind of a populist struggle, like say Pat Buchanan, with all his flaws, tried to lead in the 1980s and 90s. And I think that Rand Paul and Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others like them still are representative of. The great thing is we have that image of what the founders did for us, that torch of liberty that is held in front of our eyes. And I think every generation arises to try and relight it. And we should never be sold out to cynicism or the idea that it's too late or anything like that. It's our enemies in the cryptocracy who sow that defeatism in our ranks, therefore realizing Sun Tzu's dictum of defeating your enemy before a shot is even fired. And I think that I don't see how people can raise a family these days. Your children want to have hope as they're growing up, and yet so many families, the moms and dads say, well, we have to head for the woods and, there's no hope. And I don't think that's a healthy mentally or spiritually attitude to give to children, especially if they're Christian children, because Jesus said, occupy till I come.
Yeah, I mean, I understand. I mean, I live in the woods, right? So I understand the impulse to kind of pull away from society, but you have to build something up to replace it, right? I understand, rejecting modern American culture, but you can't just evacuate and then just be like, I'm gonna sit here in my cabin in the woods. We need to, I say we collectively, right? But doing my small part here, need to recreate so much of the arts, the sciences, divorced from truly the diseased mentality that has infected so much of the West in the post-Enlightenment era. But I think you made a very salient point there that we and are still told so frequently, right, that World War II is about was about saving Europe from the Nazi slavery, and yet the Allies turned over Europe to an even in many ways just as bad form of slavery and communism. So I
Absolutely.
think very salient points there overall. So I am deeply appreciative once again, sir, of your time, sharing some of your wisdom here with us. I can't recommend your works highly enough to the audience. Again, Michael A. Hoffman II. You can find him at revisionisthistory.org and Revelation of the Method on Substack. He is the author of Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, Usury in Christendom, an exceptional book. Can't recommend that one enough. Twilight Language, The Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, and of course, what we were discussing here today, Adolf Hitler, enemy of the German people. So, any closing thoughts, sir?
I just am very grateful to you for this opportunity, Scipio, and I wish you well in your future endeavors.
Thank you very much, sir, and look forward to having you on the show again in the future.